Jimmy Carter was the very first neoliberal president. I know that these days the progressive hosts on YouTube and everywhere else, and a lot of other progressives everywhere, including people like Bernie Sanders and Cenk Uygur, love to rehabilitate Jimmy Carter. And I really like Bernie Sanders and Cenk Uygur. I have lots of respect for them, and I think they're great people and have great policies that have done great things. Cenk Uygur has done some tremendous work. But I despise how he rehabilitates Jimmy Carter. And he means well, he's always very honest, but I think he's been fooled, like basically the rest of the world has, into thinking that Jimmy Carter is good. And of course, I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention this before in my previous video about Jimmy Carter, but oh yeah, and also Kyle Kalinske has been heavily duped into thinking that Jimmy Carter is some sort of dovish, non-interventionist, anti-war person. And of course, it's very clear to me that, oh yeah, and the late Michael Brooks seemed to have too much deference for Jimmy Carter as well. And Sahil Habibia, the progressive voice, is also in on the whole rehabilitate Jimmy Carter thing. And also, but yes, the point, and Farron Cousins also very loves Jimmy Carter and focuses on the stuff that he did after his presidency, like that even matters. But the point is, I really like all these progressive hosts that I just mentioned. I have great respect for them, and I constantly watch them. So it's not that I think they're dishonest. I just think they've been duped. They're honest people who've been duped into thinking this. And of course, on the other hand, the right wing, the crazy Republican people, they believe that Jimmy Carter was a softie and so soft on foreign policy, so bad, so liberal, and like so way too like far left on uh, all his policies. And that's really the opposite of what's true. The thing is, Jimmy Carter was actually very similar to the likes of Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, and shall I dare say George Bush and Ronald Reagan. And I've already covered this in my previous videos of Jimmy Carter on how I'm a little under the weather today, but I've already covered this in my previous videos about how Jimmy Carter um, supported the dictatorship in Iran. Jimmy Carter was very supportive of the Shah, the US-backed dictator who was allowing the United States to exploit Iranian oil and natural resources. The Shah was torturing his people and purging people he didn't like, and Jimmy Carter and the United States were very fully supportive of him. And of course, Jimmy Carter gave the Shah sanctuary when the Shah left during the Iranian Revolution, and the Iranian people wanted the Shah returned to them so that he could face trial for his crimes, but Jimmy Carter refused to hand over the Shah, and that's why the Iranians took the hostages. So that was Jimmy Carter's fault. And of course, Jimmy Carter then turned around and went to his, it's speculated that Jimmy Carter went to his good friend Saddam Hussein of Iraq, and he told Saddam, hey, go invade Iran, and Saddam Hussein invaded Iran and used chemical weapons on Iranian civilians and killed so many of them. And Jimmy Carter also created the Mujahideen because he wanted to overthrow the government of Afghanistan because he didn't like them. And of course, the Mujahideen was later used by Ronald Reagan to as a deterrent against the Soviet Union, but anyway. And of course, Jimmy Carter supported the apartheid regime in South Africa. He supported the dictatorship in Nicaragua. Jimmy Carter aided and abetted the genocide in Indonesia. Jimmy Carter kept selling weapons over and over again to them. He gave them so many weapons deals while they were doing a genocide in East Timor. The Indonesians were doing a genocide in East Timor. And Jimmy Carter kept giving them weapons, and he found sneaky ways. Carter and Mondale found sneaky ways to get U.S. weapons to Indonesia, even after the U.S. Congress had blocked the sale of weapons to Indonesia. And of course, Jimmy Carter was not supportive of the unions, totally abandoned them and flipped and went over to his corporate buddies. So the unions abandoned him in the election of 1980 and went to Ronald Reagan instead. Of course, Ronald Reagan later turned out to be, a traitor, and then he totally destroyed unions in the country, and Ronald Reagan was terrible too. But the point is, Jimmy Carter gave the United States Ronald Reagan. Without Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan would not have been possible. There's a reason Jimmy Carter lost. There's a reason Jimmy Carter got 49 electoral votes and Ronald Reagan got 489. There's a reason why the Senate flipped Republican. There's a reason why people lost faith in the Democratic Party, didn't turn out for Jimmy Carter, and just went over and because they felt betrayed by Jimmy Carter, because Jimmy Carter had not delivered. In fact, he had delivered in the other direction. He had delivered for the corporations, for the elite class. And he had totally raised his middle finger at the Great Society New Deal Democrats. and he totally served his own interests, his neoliberal interests. And so let's get to why Jimmy Carter was a neoliberal president. Um, let's see. So there's an article called How Reaganism Actually Started with Carter, and it's on Salon.com. It's by Michael Lind, and it was actually published in 2011, about 11 years ago. Look at that. Now, I'm going to read some parts and then summarize some other parts. In politics, both Carter and Reagan sought to exploit the white backlash in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Revolution that had led many white Southerners and white Northern ethnics to defect from the Democrats to support third-party populist candidate George Wallace. So they're referring to the Southern strategy, where the Southerners, and as it says, Northern ethnics left the Democratic Party because they didn't like how Lyndon Johnson had supported the Civil Rights Movement and done the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So, they took their racist asses elsewhere. And it goes on to say Reagan exploited the white backlash by beginning his general election campaign in 1980 in Neshoba County, Mississippi, where white supremacists had recently firebombed a black church and had earlier murdered 3 Northern civil rights activists, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. And Cheney is spelled Chaney. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, though. He's a civil rights activist, obviously not to be confused with the war criminal vice president from later, but obviously. In a thinly disguised appeal to white Southern racism, Ronald Reagan declared, "I believe in states' rights." Yeah, I mean, Ronald Reagan was a racist hole, but we all know that. But what's more surprising, to some of you who, like to rehabilitate Jimmy Carter used similar coded language in fishing for votes from white ethnics in the North who objected to blacks moving into their neighborhoods. Carter said, "I see nothing wrong with ethnic purity being maintained." So this is like an even very thinly veiled dog whistle sort of racist tactic that a lot of politicians like to use. Carter elaborated, "What I say is that the government ought not to make as a major purpose the intrusion of alien groups into neighborhoods simply to establish the intrusion." Yeah, that was my Jimmy Carter impression. Reverend Jesse Jackson called this a throwback to Hitlerian racism. Of course, Carter carried the South in the election of 1976, so maybe that stuff that's dog whistling worked, which is horrible. Anyway, it goes on to talk about RFK's race baiting as well, but the point is Jimmy Carter for today, so we can get to RFK in another video. Robert Francis Kennedy, that is. In foreign policy, Jimmy Carter attacked Nixon and Ford from the right. I mean, Nixon was the guy who overthrew the leftist government in Chile and installed a dictatorship and did a genocide in Cambodia. So, what can you attack from the right from there? But this was reminiscent of the way that JFK attacked Eisenhower and Nixon for being too soft on the Soviets. Seriously, it's ridiculous. But anyway, Carter was just like, "Oh, Ford, you're too soft on the Soviet Union." And Ford's like, "There is no Soviet domination in Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration." And Carter's like, "Ford's soft. Ford is too weak on foreign policy. I'm Jimmy Carter. I'm tough, and I'm hawkish." Yeah, I'm really under the weather today. But it was Carter, not Reagan. So yes. But yeah, Jimmy Carter, even from his rhetoric back in the day, of course, he's been out of office for so long, for 41 years, in fact, that he can rehabilitate his image and pretend that he's something that he's not, and he can pretend all he wants to be some sort of progressive, and most people will unfortunately be tricked and duped into following him. So that's sad. But now there's one part in this article that I kind of disagree with. So it says it was Jimmy Carter, not Ronald Reagan, who brought the religious right into national politics. And as you know, Ronald Reagan drank the religious Kool-Aid and was very cozy with the evangelicals and let them in and do whatever they want. And then it says Jimmy Carter won the Southern evangelical vote in 1976 by advertising himself as a born-again Christian. Like Ronald Reagan later, Jimmy Carter, the folksy farmer and veteran from Plains, Georgia, appealed to the nostalgia of white Americans in the 1970s for a simpler, more rural, more traditional society. But yeah, so it's talking about how Jimmy Carter blew the whistles to the evangelical right and lots of fundamentalist Christians into national politics and let them pollute everything. But that's actually, yeah, I mean, obviously Jimmy Carter did that and he was terrible and he should be reprimanded for what he did by bringing in those evangelicals. But it's not really Jimmy Carter who introduced them. It was actually Dwight Eisenhower. If you remember, Dwight Eisenhower was a Jehovah's Witness as a kid, but he was an atheist for most of his adult life, and he converted, supposedly converted to Christianity right before his, or it might have been after he got elected president. And of course, he brought in Billy Graham, that ridiculous fraud, horrible person who is now dead. But anyway, he brought in that horrible person, Billy Graham, absolute fraud and con man, as a spiritual advisor to the president. And he let Billy Graham and the evangelicals run everything. And Dwight Eisenhower used to even do performative prayers before cabinet meetings so that people could see him praying. Really reminds you of a Pharisee, but the point is, it was Dwight Eisenhower who gave those religious fundamentalists a legitimacy in national politics. So they'd already been around long before Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, and Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan continued to exploit that and use it to their disgusting advantage. So it was really Dwight Eisenhower who did that, but of course Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan were horrible and they amplified it too. And of course, as I mentioned, the Shah earlier, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the horrible dictator of Iran, who used to be around, he was first installed by Dwight Eisenhower, who had overthrown Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. So another reminder there. Dwight Eisenhower also a horrible interventionist, warmonger, and total, I don't want to use any bad words here, but Dwight Eisenhower was a total bootlicker and lapdog of the military-industrial complex. He was their guy. I was going to use the B word, but obviously I don't want to get ranked in the algorithm, and my videos are not getting enough views right now anyway, so come and watch my videos, please. But yes, Jimmy Carter was known for austerity. He promised to shrink the bureaucracy and balance the budget. Sounds like Bill Clinton and Republicans. Carter was praised by some on the right for his economic conservatism. Ronald Reagan even wrote a newspaper column titled Give Carter a Chance, so that must have been early on in Jimmy Carter's presidency. The most conservative Democrat in the White House since Grover Cleveland, Jimmy Carter fought most of his battles with Democratic progressives, not Republican conservatives. Yeah, it's like when the corporate Democrats, the neoliberals, they hate progressives and they will do anything to fight against progressives and stop and quash them. Whereas when it comes to Republicans, they want to be friends and hold hands and say, there are good Republicans, take back your party, like, oh, you're so great, we're all fellow corporatists, and like progressives, you F off. Like, that's the way corporate Democrats are, and that's the way Jimmy Carter was, because he was one of them. But it mentions the most conservative Democrat since Grover Cleveland was Jimmy Carter. And of course, Grover Cleveland was very conservative on domestic policies. He was absolutely horrible. He used the military to break up a railroad strike. But Grover Cleveland was actually pretty good on foreign policy. He refused to annex Hawaii, which used to be a separate country, but he refused to annex Hawaii, and he also refused to exploit, I believe it was Congo. And he stood up for Latin American countries against European countries. And he did a lot of good things in foreign policy because he was a non-interventionist, but like he was only good in foreign policy and his domestic policies were terrible for Grover Cleveland. Now for Jimmy Carter, both domestic and foreign were terrible because they were very hawkish. And Jimmy Carter presided over the dismantling of the New Deal regulatory system in airlines, railroads, and trucking. He intended to reduce inflation by reducing the cost of essential infrastructure to business. Sounds a lot like deregulation, doesn't it? Stuff that the Republican corporate Democrats love. And Jimmy Carter loved too, because he was one of them. Carter's market-oriented reforms backfired, and they produced constant bankruptcies, predatory hub-and-spoke monopolies in the airline industry. We have a lot of monopolies in the airline industry right now because when you go and try to book a flight, there's only like Delta and American Airlines and like very few others. There was very little competition. So thanks, Jimmy. And in the airline industry, an oligopoly in the private railroad industry, and abandoned passenger rail for freight, and underpaid, overworked truckers. That's why working class, middle class voters were disillusioned with Jimmy Carter and they turned away from him and they lost faith in him. And that's why he lost the election, because he screwed them over like this. Because Jimmy Carter was on the side of big businesses and against the side of the working class. So that's why. I mean, there's pretty simple, easy answers as to why he lost so horribly. Jimmy Ronald Reagan's victory in 1980 was not really. It wasn't really that Ronald Reagan did anything good. I mean, obviously he was horrible, so obviously he didn't do anything good. It wasn't that he was particularly skilled. It was just that Jimmy Carter really sucked and had screwed over the working class, and everyone just hated Jimmy Carter because he wasn't fighting for them. He wasn't materially delivering for them. In fact, he was materially undelivering for them. I'm really under the weather today. Not feeling well at all. Actually, I had a fever last week. Not COVID, not COVID. Yes, but the point is, yeah, Jimmy Carter expanded defense spending by a lot. It's really offense spending because it's never really been used in defense. And while Carter and Reagan disagreed on many things, we're back to the article now I'm reading. They share the neoliberal consensus that continues to provide the common assumptions for presidents of our own day, like George Walker Bush and Barack Obama and Donald J. Trump and President Biden. The New Deal consensus ended a long time ago, and it really ended with Jimmy Carter. And so here's some closing thoughts. Jimmy Carter, neoliberal president, absolutely horrible. Not the progressive hero that lots of progressives are now pretending that he is. Nothing progressive about him, as I've said in this video and my previous videos about Jimmy Carter. My point is that Lyndon Baines Johnson was probably the last New Deal president, the last president of the New Deal era, because right after him was Richard Milhous Nixon, who, as I said, dismantled the New Deal programs and did all those horrible things, froze wages, overthrew the government of Chile, did a genocide in Cambodia, did the start of the war on drugs. And so, yeah, Lyndon Johnson was really the last New Deal president because of his Great Society programs. And after that, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden. So the New Deal era really ended with Lyndon Johnson, who was the last New Deal president. And that's really sad, but it is the way it is. Of course, the New Deal era had been so well established and well maintained that it was even hard for Nixon alone to destroy it. So then Ford had to come along and continue the work, and then Carter, and then Reagan had to come along, and Reagan did most of the work in fully destroying the New Deal era. But progressives rightfully point out how Donald Trump is the culmination of all the horrible things of the Republican Party, and that the entire Republican Party is Donald Trump because they all agree on the same horrible policies. And decades and decades of horrible Republicans like Bush and Cheney and Reagan led to Trump. And it's true, he's not the first one. He's the embodiment of decades of horrible Republican policies. And people like to say, well, it started with Reagan. No, it didn't start with Reagan. It was already going on with Ford and Nixon. It was already going on with Eisenhower. It was already going on before that with Hoover and Coolidge and Harding and McKinley and Harrison and Arthur. And I would argue it started with Chester Arthur, the xenophobe who did the Chinese Exclusion Act. But the point is, Ronald Reagan was also the culmination. He was the Trump in the 1980s, where he was a culmination of decades of failed Republican policies that were destructive to the American society. And so be able to distinguish and realize what policies people really had, not the policies people say they had or the policies they pretended to have, and realize who these people actually are, because they're not who you think they are. So be impartial and objective in assessing the policies, and don't make foolish judgments or say very stupid things just because you heard something. Do some actual research. And stop rehabilitating people. It's just annoying.